Alright, this file is called lightingfilter.jpg, and originally I was going to use this in the reference section to demonstrate the lighting filter. But then when I started playing with it, I realized there's a few more things I want to do with it on top of it. So we'll put this in the workflow section instead, so that I can show you those extra steps and also give you a real world example of how you can play around with the filter. Alright, so let's come to our layers panel. Let's duplicate, call this fix. And I'm going to make my background layer invisible because that's just my safety layer in case everything goes wrong. And when you're working with filters, yes, things can go wrong. So fix, that's my new starting point. And so I'm going to duplicate this again. What shall I call this? I'll call this lighting because that is the layer that I want to do the lighting filter on. So let's come up to filters, lighting. There's my lighting filter. First thing, we need to move this around a little bit. Well, we've got this light in the middle. That's what I want to affect the most. So look, you can see I can move around by pulling this blue center button, I suppose you call it, at the bottom, and I can adjust the angle by moving the top button. Let's move it in place here. I can adjust how wide the light is, and also I can adjust how hard the shadow it creates is, like this. Now, given I've got a light which has a shade on, yeah, it could have a fairly hard shadow like this. And I want it to illuminate a little bit more, so I'll drag down like this, and I'll drag up like this. I'm going to go for exaggeration rather than realism here, because I'm looking at this on a nice big screen. You may be looking at this on a portable device which has a small screen, so it's best I exaggerate so you can see fairly clearly what I'm doing. Alright, now at this point, if I was to click on apply, I would get pretty much this effect, but without these little blue dots around. I think we can do a bit more than this. Let's take this middle button, and as I'm doing this, let's just bring the lighting panel over. Every time I move something, you can see values altering inside here, like say this direction. You can see that little circle, the little dot in the white circle adjusting. You can also click directly on this and move things around. Although, to be honest, I'd rather drag the buttons around on the screen directly. This is controlling the elevation of the light. Let's go with about there. I'm relatively happy with the outer cone, but all of a sudden I'm getting a lot of very dim light around here. Let's take a look at the ambient. Let's raise that up. Yeah, now, well look, if I take this up to 100%, that's pretty much the original color of the layer in the unlit areas. So I'd rather keep the ambient pretty high. It does mean though that I'm getting this rather blown out light effect, so I need to control this. Let's take that down the diffuse a little bit, take down the specular as well. I'm going to keep it fairly high though, because there's something I want to do with this after I've applied the filter. Okay, now here's an important thing. Quite often people will play around with the lighting filter and they'll spend a long time playing around with the color balance of their picture, but take a look at this, the specular color and the ambient light color and this color down here, the color of the light, are all plain white. I'm just applying plain white light here. Well, given this is an old-fashioned room, I doubt that will be a straight white color. So let's take a look at the color of the light. Now, I'm imagining because it's a fairly old-fashioned light, it's going to have a fairly warm color like this. That is way too yellow, I think, though. So I've set my general hue. Then what I do is I take that base hue and start moving towards the white part of the spectrum. So I'm getting, this is be a pure white, this is a flavor of white, and you can see it's affecting the lighting just around the outer parts of where the light is casting itself against those walls. All right, I'll go with that. Ambient light color. Do I want to adjust that? Yeah, that was interesting. I'm going for the opposite side of the color wheel to the light color just to get a bit of interest, but this is a pure blue light I'm putting down here. This is way too much. I'm going to make this white like this, but then I'm gradually going to move slowly towards that pure hue. So I'm just getting a tint of blue rather than a marked effect. playing around with the actual color of the light is going to have a profound difference on this filter. Okay, I'm starting to get closer to it. Maybe I want this to affect the lower parts of the picture a bit more, so I'll drop down like this with my little dot thing, and I'll bring this back up here like that. Now there is one thing here which is often overlooked: texture. If I start to play with that, you can see it's starting to slap down the texture in the lit areas. It's working on the theory that if we were looking at a bumpy surface, then the light would catch certain areas more than others, and so you get a rather more bumpy effect. And that can work. That's looking a little bit intense for me. I'm going to dial that back. I'm not sure I would use this for this particular example, but because I'm showing you how this works, look, I'll leave a slight amount of bump just there. And if you're going to do this, be aware that once you hit the apply button, that effect will suddenly get a lot more subtle, which is a little bit of a shame, but with a bit of practice, you should be able to judge how much the effect is going to be reduced by when you hit the apply button. Okay, last thing to say, which is often overlooked. We have one light in this scene. Let's come to add, because yes, you can add more than one light. Now, if it's coming from the windows, for example, it's not going to be a spotlight. It's not going to be a single source of light. It's going to be a directional light, because the sun's rays are parallel and presumably it's the sun coming through those windows. So we come to type and we click on directional. When you do that, you get this simple button here which points right at the center of the screen. You can't move that dot around. All you do is you move this top dot around like this to adjust the overall direction of the lighting it's coming from. The more you push the button towards the center of the screen, the more you get the effect of the light coming straight from you right at the picture, and the more you push away, the more directional the lighting is going to be. And so for this, do you notice, even though I've got the directional light selected, the diffuse properties of that lamp light are also being affected? So it looks like these controls are global. You're affecting the overall lighting on the picture. I think I've played with the lighting enough now. I'm going to click on apply. Watch what happens to the bumps when I click on apply. It becomes a lot more subtle. Now let's compare this with what we had before. That was my original. That's what I have now. I'm getting more lighting, but I'm also getting a slightly textured effect. Now presumably that's from me sliding the texture slider. If you don't touch that little texture, look, I'll show you the button again. This button, the texture, if you don't touch the texture button, you're going to get a lot more subtle effect. But the point I wanted to make with this is, just because we've applied the lighting filter, people often think, well, let's just leave it there. But no, there's more you can do with this. I'm going to change the layer blend mode, and I can change it to say overlay. That gives a certain effect. I can change it to one of the lighten layer blend modes like screen, color dodge, add. Each one of them is giving me a slightly different effect, which is multiplying the usefulness of this lighting filter by quite a large factor. Let's come back to, say, screen, and I'm going to duplicate again, which intensifies the effect, but also with this I'm going to come to filters, blur, Gaussian blur. Now I've set the radius up fairly high and I'm getting this very kind of soft light effect. Okay, I've set that to 23.3 pixels. I'll just apply that. If I knock out the first lighting layer underneath, I'm getting a very soft, dreamy chocolate box type effect here. And I can adjust that by 0%. There's my original. And I can gradually dial in the look I'm going for. At the moment, I'm set on screen mode. Now that I've changed the look, let's experiment again with the layer blend mode. Instead of screen, let's try add. Well, overlay is looking quite interesting. Soft light, more subtle. Hard light's giving quite a marked effect. Let's try that. Slide that up. And now that I've done that, let's take a look at my original lighting layer. That's making things lighter, but it's combining nicely with the top layer to give some very interesting effects. And I can vary that between 0% and 100%. Let's go with what, say 70%? Okay, so now I've got this layer, which is looking nice, and I've got the top layer. When I knock out the top layer, I'm getting more texture. And if I knock out the bottom layer, I'm getting this soft lighting effect here. Well, I've got a choice at this point. I can combine the two of them together. I can group them. And I can apply a layer mask to this group. Let's give this a name, shall we? Light effects. Come to my layer mask. Now I've got black selected. Let's select my brush. Let's make a big soft brush. So hold down Control plus Alt on my keyboard. I'm using a PC, so both mouse buttons. On a Mac, you just use your left mouse button, and I'll make a big soft brush like this. Oh, and all of a sudden, that's a bit of a gotcha. The white got selected when I selected the brush. So I'll come back to black, and I can paint directly on to the layer mask like this. I've got opacity 100%, and any of the bits of this new lighting effect that I don't particularly like, I can just knock out like this. Okay, I am working at breakneck speed. I know I often say that, but the minute I stop saying that, people will say, oh, you went too fast with that one. Okay, I'm going to make my brush a little bit harder like this to knock out the lighting effects inside this wardrobe because, well, you wouldn't see them there because this light wouldn't affect the shadow of the wardrobe, and the light from this window wouldn't affect the light in the wardrobe. All right, you can just cheerfully go over the bits of the corners like this, and then I press my X button to swap. So now I'm painting with white, and just paint back in the effect you want, like this. Let's have the edge of the door catch the light, make this a little bit smaller, and just do this little bit here. And also you're going to get certain bits like, say, the shadow under the plate. That won't be affected by the light as well, so I can knock out the effect there. Whoops, I just painted in white. There's a very common gotcha. Let's press Control or Command plus C, swap round to black, maybe make this a little bit smaller, and I just paint out the bits of the picture which I don't want affected by these two layers. Press X to paint back in there, and so on and so forth.